Hello everyone, my name is Danny Fuerstman and I am a professor of political science at the State College of Florida. I am the president of the SRMUN Board of Directors, and on behalf of the Board of Directors, we wanted to welcome you to our first ever virtual sermon, SRMUN Virtual Atlanta 2020. Obviously, these are not the surroundings where we are used to meeting for these opening ceremonies. We'd normally be sitting in the Capitol Ballroom in the Sheraton Atlanta. But on behalf of the board, the executive staff, and especially the staff that has worked so hard to put this conference together, we feel very confident that you're going to have a great experience, and that in fact we have many people who might not otherwise have been able to experience a sermon conference who are going to be able to take part in this experience for the first time. I've been the board president for the last year, and it's obviously been a very interesting, unprecedented year in world events and in all of our lives. And especially over the last 7 months during the pandemic, if there's one thing that has become very clear, it is that what we all do here in the world of Model United Nations is more needed now than it ever has been before. If there were people a year ago who thought that in the face of some grave danger, states and people would come together naturally to cooperate and support one another, well, I think we've all had a chance to reassess how people will actually act in those circumstances. And so the negotiation skills, the diplomatic skills, the issues that you're going to be working on over the next few days are more needed now than ever before. And we also hope that the social opportunities you'll have, the opportunities to interact with people who are, come from different parts of the country, from different parts of the world, will be maybe something that is especially welcome right now, as new social opportunities are a little harder than usual to come by. So, as I said, on behalf of the Board of Directors, I wanted to welcome you all, and if most of you are like I was during my first sermon, you're probably wondering what exactly a Board of Directors does. So we are the high-level policymaking body for SRMUN Inc. for the organization. We set all of the sort of big general directions that the organization and the conference heads into. I wanted to introduce the other members of the Board of Directors. As I mentioned, I am the president. The vice president is Jacob Howe. The secretary is Puneet Patel. We have several members at large, including Mari Cruz-Raitana, Dr. Paige Tan, Dr. Casey Delahante, Dr. Jonathan Miner. We have our executive directorate, which includes Executive Director Michael Oliaga, Deputy Executive Director for the Atlanta Conference, Jordan Dickerson, Deputy Executive Director for the Charlotte Conference, Desiree Kennedy, and our Deputy Executive Director of Technology, Geraldine Galou. And last but certainly not least, we have our two founding members who I know many of you have gotten to know over the years, Dr. Martin Slan and Dr. Cindy Combs. So at this point, I wanted to hand off the program, the opening ceremony, to our incredibly wonderful, hardworking, fantastic Secretary General, Noah Vetter, who will tell you more about what you all are in store for. So thanks so much for joining us, and we really hope that you have a great next few days here in our virtual sermon.
Honorable delegates, esteemed advisors, and distinguished guests, on behalf of the entire SRMUN Atlanta staff, it is my pleasure to welcome you to SRMUN Atlanta 2020. We are so happy to have you join us for our first ever virtual sermon conference. My name is Noah Vetter, and I have the honor of serving as your Secretary General for this year's conference. Before continuing with my remarks, I would like to thank the SRMUN staff, executive staff, and Board of Directors for all of their hard work in making this conference a reality. Despite the obstacles this year has presented, our staff has put in countless hours over the past few months to build a new type of sermon conference, one that we are confident will still deliver an outstanding experience for all of our participants. I would also like to thank you for making the effort to be with us, despite your own obstacles. We appreciate the dedication you have demonstrated to Model UN and to the ideals of international cooperation and diplomacy by being with us this weekend. This year has been an unusual one, to say the least. Across the United States and around the world, the events of this year have challenged norms, strained relationships, and added to the international community's ever-growing list of challenges. Yet despite its tumult and difficulties, this year can also offer us a lesson. It has demonstrated why, in times of crisis, we need international, national, and interpersonal cooperation. Many of the challenges created and exposed this year will not just go away. Instead, they need to be confronted and resolved through listening, dialogue, and collaboration at all levels. Everyone must be willing to research and understand issues, listen diplomatically and empathetically to the perspectives and ideas of others, and collaborate to devise inclusive solutions. In short, all of the skills learned through Model UN. It is for this reason we felt the need to host a conference this year, in order to allow you a forum to learn and practice these skills, and work together to address a few of the important challenges facing the international community. One such challenge is poverty, which is at the heart of this year's theme, understanding and combating global multidimensional poverty and inequality. 20 years ago, when establishing the Millennium Development Goals, and again in 2015 when establishing the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN chose eliminating poverty as its first goal. There are many reasons that eliminating poverty remains the first goal, including the role that poverty reduction plays in eliminating diseases and violence, and the overall economic benefits that stem from eliminating poverty. But perhaps the most important reason is those living in poverty experience violations of their basic human rights and are unable to achieve the right to life, liberty, and the security of person laid out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. While the root goal remains the same, the language changed between 2000 and 2015, in part because of an evolution in the international community's understanding of poverty. Poverty is not just a lack of money. Instead, it is experiencing interrelated deprivations in health, education, infrastructure, justice, power, and yes, money. Or as Amartya Sen put it, poverty is not having the capability to realize one's own full potential as a human being. While this theme of multidimensional poverty was chosen back in December of 2019, before we ever knew how the events of this year would unfold, it seems to me as important as ever. As a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and the corresponding economic disruption, the UN predicts that by the end of 2020, more than 71 million people will be pushed into extreme poverty, the first increase in global poverty in decades. Alongside the economic effects, there are other concerns, such as the millions of children who are being left behind in their education because they cannot participate in remote learning, or the millions of individuals who are forced to continue working in unsafe conditions because they have no alternative and have insufficient social protection to support them. These conditions, this pandemic, serves to further highlight the multidimensionality of poverty. So why does it matter? Why should you care about multidimensional poverty? Simply put, we cannot eliminate poverty without understanding it, and that means understanding its multidimensionality. I expect that many of you will become leaders and influencers in your own right, whether in the public sector or the private sector, whether in your local community or the international community. In these roles, you will have a chance to influence how poverty is understood and addressed. Whatever position you end up in, it is my hope that you will consider multidimensionality and allow it to influence your deliberations and your actions. You have ahead of you now a weekend of collaboration and diplomacy with fellow leaders from around North America. I encourage you all to take advantage of it, to listen and be respectful of each other's ideas, to learn and practice new skills, and to cooperate in developing impactful and innovative resolutions. I thank you all for your hard work in preparing for the conference. Now I encourage you to take that preparation and turn it into action in committee and help us make this unique conference our best one yet. It is now my distinct pleasure to welcome the first of our keynote speakers, Dr. Sabina Alkire. Dr. Alkire directs the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, OPHI, a research center at the University of Oxford. She is known for developing, along with James Foster, the Alkire-Foster method for measuring multidimensional poverty. This method serves as the basis for the Global Multidimensional Poverty Index, the MPI, used by the United Nations Development Program to measure multidimensional poverty in 107 countries as part of the annual Human Development Report. Along with OPHI, Dr. Alkire works to expand usage of the MPI and other measures of multidimensional poverty, and has advised national governments on how to use the measures in their policymaking. Welcome, Dr. Alkire.
Greetings. I'm Sabina Alkire, and I'm so delighted to be with you at the Southern Regional Model United Nations. I wish that we could all be together. The theme and the timing of this theme in the course of global events is vital. It's one that's dear to our hearts, but it's also the lived experience of so many people who find that their lives have been toppled by the COVID pandemic. And it's a time when we need leaders, we need leadership, we need courage to do things differently. What I would like to do is talk a little bit about combating global poverty, but first talk about understanding it, a little bit about how to measure it. But I want to do so thinking of you in positions of leadership. And so I'm going to begin with a story Amartya Sen put in the Financial Times on April 15th of this year. He was commenting on the Queen of England's speech during the pandemic, encouraging people. But he reflected that it is a need for policy action and not for trepidation. During World War II, in Britain, there was a food scarcity, there was a food availability decline. And because of the food shortage, some policymakers put in a rationing system. And during the decade of the 1940s, while the war raged, male life expectancy increased by 6.5 years, and female life expectancy increased by 7 years during a time of food shortage. In the decade before the war, male life expectancy had only increased by 1.2 years, and female by 1.5. And so the pandemic, with its threat to impoverish so many, its threat to have the yawning jaws of inequality widen yet more, is also an invitation for decisive policy action, where, despite all odds, with wise policies, both poverty and inequality can contract. I'm going to be focusing on multidimensional poverty. This has been a theme for many who have listened to the voices of the poor and heard how they describe their condition, in which money is only one form of the many deprivations they face at the same time. And in a multidimensional poverty perspective, we ask, what deprivations are people carrying at the same time? You see them walking down the street, perhaps, but do you know that their roof leaks, or that their child is out of school, or that they're actually out of a job seeking work, or that they live in a very dangerous neighborhood? So poverty is multidimensional, and we are interested in the different forms and dimensions of poverty that people are experiencing. So, for example, and I'll be peppering this presentation with quotes from world leaders on poverty. And these quotes come in part from UN General Assembly events that we have had the privilege to host since 2014, because our research center is secretariat of a South-South multidimensional poverty peer network, MPPN. And each year we gather together heads of state and ministers and heads of agencies and other senior leaders to discuss how to fight poverty in all its forms and dimensions. So this year, the side event was co-hosted by Chile and Pakistan, and Prime Minister Imran Khan pointed out not only is poverty something painful for those who experience it, but it's also the worst and most pervasive violation of human rights. And for the sake of human dignity, we must make it visible and combat it. So I'd like to introduce you first to the measurement of multidimensional poverty, because we talk about global multidimensional poverty, and this index, which was co-designed by our research group OFI with the United Nations Development Programme's Human Development Report Office in 2010, is such a measure in that it covers this year 107 countries and 5.9 billion people, which is over 3/4 of the population of the world and a good portion of the population of the developing world. So let me give you an example of how we measure poverty. In this measure, it has 3 dimensions: health, education, and living standards. In other national MPIs, they add employment or environment or shocks of violence and disasters. But in the global MPI, there are 3 equally weighted dimensions, and there are 10 indicators. You're deprived if anyone in your household is undernourished, or if a child has died in the last 5 years, or if nobody in your household has completed 6 years of schooling, or if a child is not attending school up to the age at which they would complete class 8. You're deprived if you don't have clean cooking fuel, but you cook with wood or charcoal or dung, if you don't have adequate sanitation, or if it's shared, if you don't have safe drinking water within 30 minutes round trip, if you don't have access to electricity to charge your phone or to turn on at night, if your house has rudimentary or natural materials for the roof, the walls, or the floor, like a dirt floor or a thatch roof, or cardboard walls. And if you don't own more than one of a small set of assets: radio, telephone, television, animal cart, bicycle, motorcycle, computer, refrigerator, and if you own a car or a truck, you're not deprived in assets. So what do we do in order to understand people's deprivation load across these 10 indicators? We start, and we're economists, we start with data sets, and we look at information for each person within a household and the deprivation shared across the household. And just before I get into how we make the MPI, I'd like to tell you one thing, which is that those deprivation loads really are quite extensive, because across the 10 indicators I just named, at least 81% of people who experience any of the deprivations are deprived in more than one. And for example, 99% of people who deprived in electricity have at least one more deprivation, and most have 5 or 6. And so now empirically we have data, and we can look and see these overlapping deprivations. But how do we make it tangible, actionable by you in the United Nations? So to do that, first, I've already explained the priority indicators, but second, for each person or household, we build a deprivation profile. So for example, this person example, she's deprived in nutrition, she's deprived in years of schooling, and in all the living standard indicators. So if we add them up, she's deprived in 2/3 of the weighted indicators. So who is poor? If you have one indicator, you might not be poor. You might have a low body mass index because you're a fashion model. You might not have electricity, but you have a different source of energy. You might have a dirt floor because you have an eco house. For us, if a person is deprived in at least 1/3 of these dimensions at the same time, they're MPI poor. And so the cutoff is 1/3. And then to compute the MPI, we multiply it times the percentage of people who are poor because they're deprived in 1/3 or more of the indicators, times the deprivation scores of the poor, the average among them. This person was deprived in 66%, but on average, maybe it's 46%. So that's the intensity. I know you're probably not measurement people, but the important thing for people in positions of power when we talk about statistics like this is for you to have confidence that these statistics are based on the real experiences of poor people and that they're rigorous. They've been published in good journals, they're reported with standard errors, with confidence intervals, robustness tests, and so that you can have confidence when you face the press that the statistics you're talking about are important. So what are the headlines? Because we're talking about global multidimensional poverty. Well, globally, across this definition of acute poverty, remember it's undernutrition, it's no water, 1.3 billion. So 22%, more than 1 in 5 people of the 5.9 billion are deprived in at least 1/3 of those indicators. It's not very good news, and that's using the most recent data. Usually it's from 2013, but a few countries we go back to 2008. Of those 1.3 billion people, 1/2 of them have not celebrated their 18th birthday, their children. Their childhood is being impacted by these conditions. You might think most of the poor people live in low-income countries, but 2/3 of the poor people live in middle-income countries. You might think that most of the poor people live in Africa, but actually it's about equal between South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And when you think of poverty, you might think of slums in rural areas, but overwhelmingly, poor people live in rural areas. And when we say multidimensional, we mean multidimensional. 99% of the 1.3 billion people have 3 deprivations in their deprivation load they carry. 82% have 5. And so this is a world pre-COVID in which already 1.3 billion people are shouldering a lot of difficulties. Good news, we did a study of 5 billion people in 75 countries, and in 65 countries, they reduced MPI statistically significantly. And the fastest reduction of all the countries was Sierra Leone, followed by Mauritania, followed by Liberia. So sub-Saharan African countries led in terms of a strong reduction of MPI. But other countries with lower levels of poverty made tremendous progress. For example, 4 countries, including India, cut their MPI by half. China had very low levels of poverty already, but still got 70 million people out of poverty. So this was before COVID, and COVID has affected us. Each of us in this room have been affected. But if you think of the people who already were carrying 3, 5, 7, 9 deprivations at the same time, and then COVID comes and it adds 1 more deprivation to their burden, they experience the pandemic differently, and we have to think about that. How has COVID increased poverty numbers? We did some projections and simulations in our research group. The papers are online if you're interested. And we found that basically, depending on which of 6 scenarios that we modeled you want to look at, COVID is setting us back between 3.1 and 9.9 years. So the poverty today could be a lot higher than 1.3 billion. But I want to end on a note of hope before we talk about combating it. And this is real. These are real data. Sierra Leone, I mentioned, was the fastest country to reduce MPI. It was the fastest of the 70 countries and 5 billion people. And yet that time period, 2013 to 2017, was the time period in which Ebola raged in the country and then was brought into control in March 2016. And as we know from COVID, pandemics like Ebola, they require policymakers like you in the United Nations to make decisions fast, at galloping speed. And human error is inevitable, and human tragedy is inevitable. But the positive note, and this came out of the data, is that across 75 countries, the fastest reduction was in Sierra Leone. So a question again for us in this time of COVID, when poverty is going up, when we feel overwhelmed because fiscal resources are going down, we're in a global recession, what can we do? Can you be leaders? Can you make an inflection point in the world in poverty? We need your serious creativity and courage and compassion to do that. So in the second part, I'd like to talk about combating multidimensional poverty. That was the second half of the title that Noah set for the Southern Regional United Nations. And I like that. Some people may say combating, it's too violent, but actually you need to confront and redress these deprivation loads our brothers and sisters are carrying. So I begin with a quote from President Piñera, who co-hosted with the government of Pakistan our General Assembly event this year. And he said it's important to measure, and Chile has a national MPI, but not only to measure, we have also to act to face poverty in a multidimensional way. So if you as leaders are simply articulate about global multidimensional poverty in the United Nations, I'm glad if you were students, but as leaders, you failed, because your job is to change those numbers and to figure out how to do so. So I'd like to show you what has worked a little in some of the countries. I've been talking about the global MPI. The global MPI you can compare across, as I said, 107 countries. But a number of countries also have tailored their MPI to their own context. Maybe they had a data source that had informal work or child labor or violence or environment or social protection or other indicators. So these national MPIs are also used as policy instruments, and they're also official permanent statistics. So Tsereng Tobgay, who was the Honorable Prime Minister of Bhutan, when he spoke at our United Nations event at 2015, at the launch of the Sustainable Development Goals, he said this metaphor: measures are like eyes. They help us to see things. They bring matters into focus. Bhutan's national MPI is not only a measure, it is a tool, a policy tool. So when you are in positions of leadership, can you crystallize fancy academic stuff, the stuff your technical advisors say, into a memorable image? Measures are like eyes. And can you wear your traditional clothing, and may it be as gorgeous as the Kira and Ko in Bhutan? How are some of the ways that policymakers are having the courage to use measures? One is simply to complement monetary poverty statistics. For example, Carlos Alvarado, president of Costa Rica, observed that before 2015, they simply had looked at income. But now, understanding the voices of the poor, understanding the Sustainable Development Goals that prioritize poverty in all its forms, they've adopted the MPI. And he said, with the MPI, the difference is you're not only attacking income, you're not only combating income poverty, you're going to the roots of the problem. Why is there low income? There's also poor health, there's also poor education, but also we believe these multidimensional aspects have intrinsic value. It's not only ways to make income, but it's also part of a good life. Now, I want to say something about Andhra Pradesh in India. It's a state in India, and between 2009 and 2016, Andhra Pradesh made the fastest reduction in the global MPI. And so the state decided to launch a state-level MPI, and it did so in 2018. Now I want you to look at the two young men, one in a black shirt and one right next to him in a black blazer. Those men had just finished their undergraduate, and they were hired as an experiment, as sort of a youth unemployment program, to be part of the state metrics. And they were the ones actually that prepared the state-level MPI for Andhra Pradesh. Where do you think those young men are 2 years later? They're in the national government of India, 1 billion people, and they're designing its national MPI and the use of the MPI in policy. Don't think because you are young, you can't do anything. You can. And I hope that you will. We need your energy, just like India needed the creativity of Alan and Sean. They're also, of course, used to see how poverty goes down. For example, in his speech in the United Nations, the Prime Minister of Nepal mentioned that Nepal had cut their MPI by half in a mere 8 years. But one of the most difficult things for policymakers and for leaders is allocating resources, because you make a lot of enemies when you take money away or you don't give people the money that they want. But in Costa Rica, again, when they launched their MPI in 2016, they looked at the allocation across their regions, and they found that they were not allocating the most to the poorest regions. They looked at their allocation across the indicators of their MPI, and that they found for some indicators there was zero budget allocation to reduce MPI. And so they changed it, and poverty reduction accelerated. Now, that's another interesting story. Who is the minister who developed the MPI in Costa Rica? And who is the minister that made those really difficult changes? It was Carlos Alvarado. He's now president of Costa Rica. And in our September General Assembly event this year, he said that because their original MPI showed mismatches between policy objectives and allocations, the previous president, Solis, issued a decree that MPI must be part of the allocation formula in the future. And that has continued. And Costa Rica, despite a very difficult financial time at the moment, is still making inroads on poverty. There's also a coordination problem. If you are a leader, that means you are also a manager. And you may have lots of ministers, and they're very happy to be ministers. And they want to compete with each other. Maybe they want to be the next president or prime minister. And so you have a problem in coordinating across these egos. And then you have a bureaucracy where people have traditionally worked in silos. And so the education ministry has done education, and the health ministry has done health, and the labor ministry has done labor. And they think that that's more efficient because they have a kind of expertise. But in the Sustainable Development Goals, based on empirical analysis from the Millennium Development Goals, they found that it was cheaper and more cost efficient to address multiple poverty-related deprivations together, synergistically, in an integrated fashion. So that is actually in the documents of the SDGs. But how do you do that when you've got your bureaucracy and you've got your egos? Rebecca Greenspan observed that we have to understand these interconnections between different aspects of poverty. She said poverty is a complex issue. It is something dynamic and changing, and the MPI captures in a greater way this complexity and takes us out of the description of a photograph to be able to look at a film, to look at a reality in evolution. And why is that important? Picture a child, and that child might be out of school, and that child might be undernourished. if you put a midday cooked meal, as India did, in the school, the child's mother says, hey, if my child goes to school, she gets a cooked meal. And so she'll send her child to school. The child will get a cooked meal and so benefit from nutrition, and she'll be in school, so benefit from education. So that's an example of integrated multi-sectoral policies. Our colleague Gonzalo Hernandez Licona, who is the director of the Multidimensional Poverty Peer Network, came up with this slide when he led multidimensional poverty work in Mexico. He said it's like a perfect strike. What you're trying to do with the MPI is both have the indicators you want to reduce and also the interconnections between them all visible, so that you can plan your bowling shot to knock down many deprivations that are attacking poor people with minimal resources. So what does that mean in practice? Go to Colombia, and President Santos launched their MPI in 2011, and he created a round table, like the round table of the knights, and he chaired the round table. And the round table had the ministries you see in the slide there. And they couldn't send a deputy, they had to come in person. And he asked them, okay, how are we doing on monetary poverty? How are we doing on multidimensional poverty? And he would put up this slide, which was the 15 indicators of their national MPI. And he'd show them each of the indicators and where they were. And the green light was that they were doing fine. Yellow is it was moving slowly, and red light, it wasn't working. And if it wasn't working, he would say to the Minister of Labor, why are the employment indicators not coming down? And so the ministers were held accountable. But they also learned that they needed to work together. So for example, they took the 5 dimensions of the national MPI in Colombia, and they mapped them against the institutions you'll see in the bottom. And they realized actually, in terms of employment, there are 4 ministries whose work overlaps with employment. And so the Minister of Labor could say, excuse me, but I need my friend ministers to work with me to reduce this problem. And it was really quite interesting in 2015 when we had the MPPN meeting in Cartagena in Colombia. There was a panel with President Santos and another one with some of the ministers. And they were describing what they learned from each other about the interconnections and their need to work together as a team to move the ball of poverty down the field and reduce it. And he said, you know, as Minister of Health, I needed to find out what my friend Minister of Environment, Minister of Housing, Minister of Drinking Water was doing, because I couldn't meet my targets if she didn't meet hers. And so that's what, as a leader, communicating the importance of poverty, making sure people know this is a roundtable, I'm personally chairing, you have to be there. Making very clear goals, how much it should go down. Asking people why it's not moving. Having people talk about how to address it, that's important. And the last thing that was important is that each year, as a team around the president, they came up with new public policies to accelerate. So they saw what was stuck, and that was their alert, their red stoplight. And then they did a policy to try to help that group of ministries move it. So these are slides used with permission from the government of Colombia. And each year they did that progress, going through different indicators that were stuck. And then after the peace accord was signed, then it was implementation of the peace deal. And of course, as you know, poverty reduction was part of the work of that government, but so was the peace agreement, for which President Santos got the Nobel Prize. But peace and poverty perhaps are connected. Poverty of the victims and poverty of the ex-combatants, and both need to be redressed. We're nearing the end, but I just wanted to tell you that so far I've been showing you pictures of national numbers and talking about national leaders, except for the state of Andhra Pradesh. But actually the MPIs are often disaggregated by subnational regions, by people with disabilities, by ethnicity, by children, by rural urban areas, different subgroups. And then for each of the subgroups, we not only see who is poor, how poor they are, but we pull the MPI apart into its component indicators to know how they are poor. So that whether you're a state governor or a county leader, you know what the poverty is for your county. You know its shape. And so you can do your part, put your shoulder against that wheel to move the needle on poverty. So it's like a high resolution lens. There's a national statistic, the president can announce the trend, but you can zoom in and see your local story. So for example, when we launched the Global MPI in 2018, we led with a story on India, where in a decade, 270 million people, more than the population of many, many countries, had come out of poverty in a decade. And that trend was pro-poorest, according to all the social groups we measured in India. This is Minister Jackson Mthembe from South Africa, and their MPI is created from a census. And so when South Africa was hit by COVID, they had a relatively recent census, and they used that very granular data with other data to plan their COVID response. So did Colombia, under a new government, an opposition government. So this is my last slide, and I'd like to go back to what I said at the beginning about Amartya Sen, talking during World War II, despite a food shortage decline, with wise and courageous policies, there was an increase in life expectancy. Sierra Leone, despite the Ebola period from December 2013 to March 2016, between 2013 and 2017, it reduced MPI faster than any other of 75 countries. Now we are in the COVID pandemic. Poverty is on the rise. There's a danger of inequality also spiraling out of control. But Sanya Nishtar, the Minister for Poverty Alleviation in Pakistan, said we have a once-in-a-generation chance to build a fairer world that ends poverty and inequality and the climate crisis. Let's not waste this chance. So my hope for you in the Model United Nations is that you will take seriously this responsibility. You'll use the Model United Nations to hone your skills, but you'll also remember that even in a couple years, even as a younger person, you are able to have a footprint, and that footprint can affect the deprivation loads that billions are carrying. I wish you the very best, and I look forward to hearing how it has gone. Bye for now.
Thank you, Dr. Alkire, for those remarks. I now have the pleasure of welcoming our second keynote speaker, Dr. Keetie Roelen. Dr. Roelen is a research fellow and co-director of the Center for Social Protection at the Institute of Development Studies in the United Kingdom. A development economist by training, Dr. Roelen's research looks at the dynamics of child poverty, social protection, and the relationships between child protection and social protection. As a researcher for the Center for Social Protection, she has worked to increase the usage of social protection systems in development policy, and to develop systems that are sustainable and pro-poor. The center also looks at the role of social protection programs in poverty alleviation efforts, both in general and in relation to shocks like the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Roelen has also worked with a variety of international organizations, including UNICEF, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and Save the Children. Welcome, Dr. Roelen.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for having invited me to hold this speech at the Southern Regional Model United Nations Conference in Atlanta. Thank you very much to the organizers for allowing me to hold this keynote speech about social protection and reducing multidimensional poverty. And in the next 15 to 20 minutes, I will talk about the role of social protection in reducing multidimensional poverty, how various UN actors have engaged with social protection, and what the role for social protection has been in response to COVID-19 and moving forward with respect to the pandemic and the future. So first off, I'd like to indicate that social protection is key to the Sustainable Development Goals. So if we look at the first SDG, we can see that there is a target that's specifically focused on social protection. Target 1.3 says that we should implement nationally appropriate social protection systems and measures for all, including floors, and that by 2030, a substantial proportion of the poor and vulnerable should be covered. So with this target, it's been recognized that social protection is a key policy tool to reduce poverty and counter poverty in all its forms, which of course relates to the first two targets within the SDGs, which refers to poverty in monetary terms and very much so also in multidimensional terms. But the role of social protection within the SDGs is not limited to the first SDG only. So if we look at the other SDGs, we can see social protection popping up either within its targets or the underlying narratives. So this relates to SDG 3 in relation to health and well-being, in relation to SDG 5 around gender equality, SDG 8 with respect to decent work and economic growth, and also SDG 10 as a goal to reduce inequalities, both vertical and horizontal inequalities. So social protection as a policy measure has become embedded within the SDGs. And that means that across the United Nations, across its various agencies and platforms, social protection has moved up the top of the agenda. Now, before we talk any further about the role of social protection in reducing multidimensional poverty or how various UN agencies have engaged with it, let's have a closer look at what social protection actually consists of. Well, commonly we divide social protection in three categories. The first category is social assistance. Social assistance refers to so-called non-contributory mechanisms, meaning that policies are paid from general tax revenue. And so as an individual, you don't have to pay into the system in order to get something out. Social assistance, in terms of its objective, by and large, tries to protect people against the hardship of poverty and provides them with a basic level of support. Types of programs under social assistance could be child benefits, school feeding programs, or social pensions. And often we also see programs that are very much targeted towards the poor. So instead of focusing on certain demographic groups, these provisions will specifically aim to reach poor and vulnerable people. Now, the second group of mechanisms or policies is called social insurance. Social insurance are also called contributory mechanisms because as an individual, you have to pay into the scheme in order to benefit from it in case a shock occurs. And shocks can be so-called covariate shocks that hold across a large group, such as drought, for example, or idiosyncratic risks or shocks, which refer to more individual or localized shocks, such as illness, injury, or maybe unemployment. Insurance mechanisms kick in when such a shock occurs and when you have negative or experience negative consequences as a result. So for example, health insurance when we're ill, unemployment insurance, agricultural insurance, or funeral insurance. Now, many insurances that we know are provided privately through private companies, but when we talk about social insurance, we mostly mean insurance that's either entirely operated or supported by governments. Finally, the third category refers to labor market programs. And these have a much more, if you will, aspirational view in terms of trying to move people out of poverty and especially into work. So there's a focus on self-sufficiency and resilience. And here mechanisms focus a lot on getting people into the formal labor market. This could be skills training for youth to counter youth unemployment, microfinance or microcredit, and also labor activation policies, which are very popular in high-income countries to tackle long-term unemployment. In terms of the three categories, particularly when we look at low and middle income countries, social assistance is the biggest category. And certainly that's the case when we think about the expansion of social protection in the last 10 to 20 years. A lot of focus has been on those non-contributory mechanisms, and particularly on cash transfers or in-kind or food transfers to protect and help the most vulnerable. Now, what different agencies and partners are involved? And I'm going to focus particularly here on UN agencies and platforms, of course, in relation to the conference. Now, if we look at the middle picture, that is the cover of a strategy on social protection that was put out in 2012 by the World Bank. And the World Bank is a key actor in social protection, both at global level and at national level. In Washington, as well as at country levels, they promote social protection as a key policy area, but they're also a big funder of large social protection and social assistance programs in many countries. And so they have a lot of influence when it comes to design and implementation of programs, and have been really key to advancing social protection as a policy area. Now, on the left-hand side, you see another cover of another strategy, and this was published in 2019 and is by UNICEF, UNICEF's Global Social Protection Program Framework. UNICEF, as you can imagine, focuses particularly on children, and also at global and country level has been instrumental to advocating for social protection, but also supporting governments and other actors to think about design and implementation. Now, they have a special focus on children, but that doesn't mean that they don't look at social protection at large. UNICEF adopts what's called a life cycle approach. So they particularly zoom in on the relevance of social protection for children, but also consider children as part of families, as part of communities. And so there's great awareness that social protection also needs to expand to those in other stages of the life cycle and community at large to be effective. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the framework that was put forward a few years ago by FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization. FAO has been a newer actor when we think about UN agencies within the landscape of social protection. And they have found their niche by focusing particularly on agriculture and rural livelihoods. And so the programs that they support often have linkages to agricultural promotion or programs around livelihoods diversification. They're very focused on the social assistance aspect of social protection. And one of the types of programs that they've been focusing on in recent years is a so-called cash plus programming to boost productivity. And that means that cash transfers might be combined with training about crop diversification, for example, or techniques to improve harvests. At the bottom, you see a banner, not of a UN agency as such, but of an important annual platform within the UN, namely the Commission on the Status of Women. And this is the banner from last year, from 2019, when this platform focused particularly on social protection alongside public services and infrastructure. And during the week or the 10 days of this annual meeting, the focus was very much on how public services and public policy, such as social protection, is key to women's lives and to ensuring gender equality in the realm of the economy, but also other social areas. And so all this shows that across the UN, social protection has been acknowledged and is being worked on as a key policy area in relation to poverty, but in relation to improving people's lives and improving equality in general. Now, the big question, of course, is, does it work? Does it help to have social protection, particularly in relation to multidimensional poverty? Well, this graph, or this slide with these graphs, is a nice indication of the positive effects of social protection. On each line, if you will, is a different program from a different country. And on the left-hand side, we see the effect in relation to incidence of multidimensional poverty. And on the right-hand side, we see the effect in terms of intensity of multidimensional poverty. The top two graphs are in relation to the productive safety net program in Ethiopia. In the middle, we see the graphs in relation to Juntos in Peru, which is a conditional cash transfer program. And at the bottom, we see the NREGA program, which is a public works program in India. And what you can see across these graphs is that the line, the blue line, which denotes participants in these programs, falls considerably after participation in these programs with respect to multidimensional poverty in comparison to non-participants, which is the red dotted line. So if people start participating in the programs, their incidence and intensity of multidimensional poverty drops. And this is supported by further econometric calculations using matching techniques and differences estimates to indicate that these impacts are significant. And this is mirrored by studies across the world looking at the impact of social protection and particularly social assistance and cash transfers, showing that cash transfers has a positive impact on household consumption, food security, the experience of hunger, access to schooling and health services, etc. Lives improve across the board when families and individuals start participating in social protection programs. It should be said, though, that not in all outcome areas the impact is overwhelmingly positive. So when we talk about more intractable problems, such as learning outcomes, for example, so tests in mathematics or in language, there's not always a very positive link to social protection. And that means that there are other things that need to be looked at that need to complement social protection, and that there's a need for a cross-sectoral approach to really improve outcomes in people's lives, also for those more difficult areas to reach. So, for example, think about improving quality of education. That's not part of social protection per se, but is vital to come together with social protection if it is to improve that element of people's lives. Now then, what's next for social protection? And that's a question that I ask particularly in relation to the world that we live in today and the pandemic that we're living through. With COVID-19, social protection has been a crucial policy response to the negative socio-economic implications for many people around the world. There's been a tremendous number of new measures, of expanded measures across low, middle, and high income countries that have helped people that have lost their jobs and their livelihoods. And so that gives rise to interesting question about what's next for social protection, because in moving forward, how can we build on that enthusiasm and that expansion of social protection? And how can we use that to leverage new support to create even more coverage for social protection and better systems? The graph that you see here on this slide is a sort of a scenario approach to thinking about where we might move next with social protection. And it provides a scenario whereby, with respect to COVID, we see fluctuating infection rates. And we hypothesize that it might be quite a few years before there's an effective treatment, and we no longer have to adapt our lives in relation to the virus. Now, in relation to this scenario, we can think about where next for social protection in sort of two ways. First, in the short to medium term, we have to really keep an eye on making sure that those who are most vulnerable, who are still at risk of losing their job or face unemployment, are adequately protected. And so some of the emergency measures that have been put in place quickly after the onset of the pandemic may need to be in place for much longer. And so there's a real need to think about how can we maintain coverage for those who need it. And then moving towards the medium and long term, more ambitious questions about how to strengthen systems, how to build the administrative capacity, how to ensure the financial capacity for the expansion of social protection is going to be crucial. Now, the longer, of course, this pandemic lasts, the more the lines between the short and medium term and the medium and long term will become blurry. And we cannot wait with thinking about some of the long-term issues around systems building or making sure that our systems are climate smart or shock responsive. We cannot wait with that until the pandemic is truly over, because that might well be quite a few years down the line. So that leaves me with a final question for you as you embark on this conference. What is the role for social protection moving forwards, thinking about how vital its need is, and thinking about how the pandemic has shown that social protection can play such an important role for many people, not just those who are at the bottom of the income distribution and considered to be very poor, but for a lot of us who have moved into precarious livelihoods, against the reality that there's going to be an economic recession across the world, that there's going to be economic contraction, and so less money available to pay for all these support services and programs. How are we going to find the balance between greater need and possibly fewer resources? Now, I will leave you on a positive note, saying that some of the key actors, including people at the World Bank, do think that there's a change in narrative around social protection. And so whilst maybe 10, 20 years ago, it was seen as something quite residual within the policy package, only something that was there to support really those who are in dire needs, it has now entered mainstream debate and mainstream policy making. And there's a recognition that this is not something that we only use in real desperate times, but is something that needs to be part of the foundation of how we support our societies and communities, particularly when a shock occurs. So certainly there's appetite, and certainly the narrative is changing. And I think that's a very positive message to think about how we move forward with social protection. Thank you very much again, and good luck with your conference.
Thank you, Dr. Roelen, for those remarks. It is now my pleasure to introduce the staff of SRMUN Atlanta 2020, beginning with the executive staff. Director General Ryan Bearwald, Deputy Director General Mike Engelhart, and Undersecretary General Jessica Doscher. Followed by our committee staff, who are responsible for writing the committee background guides and overseeing the individual committees. General Assembly Plenary Director Helen Smith, and Assistant Directors Mira Patel and Andrew Whitmire. General Assembly First Committee Director Austin Brennan, and Assistant Directors Claire Hodges and Hunter Nimmo. The Food and Agriculture Organization Director Rachel Winnock, and Assistant Directors Kathleen Cano and Daniel Felberg. The Economic and Social Council Director Christina Dry and Assistant Director Jacob Howe. The United Nations Development Program Executive Board Director Alyssa Jamie and Assistant Director Mia Baxley. The Commission on the Status of Women Director Asha Coutrere and Assistant Director Marissa Weaver. Peacebuilding Commission Director Chantel Hover and Assistant Director Emily Bowen. Security Council Director Leanna Christensen and Assistant Director Tahira Smith. And last, but certainly not least, our Assistant Undersecretary General Olivia Liska. Thank you for joining us for our opening ceremony this year. We look forward to a wonderful conference ahead. And now it is my pleasure to declare SRMUN Atlanta 2020 open.